Hello, everyone, and welcome. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Before we begin, feel free to follow our social media. On Twitter, follow our account at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we will be sure to retweet. We would love to hear your thoughts and engagements about this conversation. So once again, on Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, like the page at Campaign for GLR. Okay, once again, welcome to today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last 20 to 30 minutes to respond to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed on Friday to all who registered. And we are also live streaming this session on Facebook. Lastly, we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Lastly, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars, including sessions in our regular 3 p.m. Eastern time slot and frequent sessions in this earlier 12:30 p.m. Eastern time slot as well. Later today, we will host a Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinar on scaling playful learning, hearing from a panel of experts and local leaders as they discuss the myriad ways that cities can shape public schools to combine play and learning to support early brain development. Please do note that GLR Learning Tuesdays will be on a brief holiday hiatus for the next 3 weeks, but will return on January 12th with a double header focused on how we can slow, stop, and reverse learning loss and support children's progress moving forward with the heads of American Federation of Teachers and National Education Association in the 12:30 webinar and with school superintendents and other education leaders in the 3 p.m. webinar. The registration link for these upcoming GLR Learning Tuesday sessions are posted in the chat box. Joining you now is Sarah Torian, a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays Funder to Funder conversation entitled Translating Good Research into Good Policy, the William T. Grant Foundation. This is the 7th session in our new series of funder-focused webinars that we launched this past summer in response to what CGLR leaders heard during their 2018 listening tour, as state and local funders asked for more opportunities to come together for shared learning and to explore the potential for increased collaboration, alignment, and co-investment with their local funder peers as well as with their more national counterparts. Today's conversation is a wonderful example of just that, how funders can align their efforts to increase their impact. Our nation is in the midst of a transition right now. We've got a new administration and a new Congress that will be taking office next month. And despite the incredibly wonderful news that an effective new vaccine is being distributed literally as we speak in states across the country right now, our national leaders will face many daunting challenges when they take office next month. One of those challenges is the inequality that has plagued our country since its very founding, inequalities that limit the life outcomes of people of color. And while the current partisan divide and gridlock will no doubt continue to be a barrier to progress in many areas, There are a number of areas of agreement across party lines supporting the policies and programs that can address these structural inequities, and as a result, help to increase the impact and effectiveness of the local programs that many local funders in the GLR network are supporting. The William T. Grant Foundation is committed to investing in research that aims to build, test, and increase our understanding of programs, policies, and practice that promote equitable opportunities and outcomes for young people, and ensuring that research evidence is used by national, state, and local decision makers and others in ways that benefit youth. Today, we will learn a little bit more about that commitment as we explore the findings of a National Academies report outlining how we as a nation might reduce child poverty by half over the next 10 years. We'll also hear about that bipartisan agreement in support of many of the policies and programs that can help achieve that ambitious and incredibly important goal, and the role that local funders can play in advancing these efforts. And to begin that conversation, I am incredibly honored to introduce and welcome our amazing panel of presenters. There's a lot I could share about each of them, but I think we're all more eager to hear from them than from me. So just wanted to let you know that I've posted a link in the chat box to longer bios for each of them. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Adam Gameron. Adam is the president of the William T. Grant Foundation, where he launched a Reducing Inequality initiative in 2014. Previously, he held the John D. MacArthur Chair in Sociology and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he spent 3 decades engaged in research on educational inequality and school reform. So welcome, Adam. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Lawrence Aber. Larry Aber is the Wilner Family Professor of Psychology and Public Policy at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and University Professor at New York University, where he also serves as the co-director of the International Research Center Global Ties, Transforming Intervention, Effectiveness, and Scale for Children. His research examines the influences of poverty and violence at the family and community levels on the development of children and youth. And for the purposes of today's conversation, he was a member of the National Academy's Research Committee in the development of its 2019 report, Roadmap for Reducing Child Poverty. Next, I'd like to welcome and introduce Jason Grumet. Jason is the founder and president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he works to harness the power of collaboration to advocate for principled and politically viable policy solutions to some of the major challenges facing our country, including early childhood programs, access to quality health care, and much more. Joining these co-presenters today are 2 commentators who are also deeply engaged in promoting improved child outcomes. First, I'd like to welcome Milton Little. Since 2007, Milton has served as the president and CEO of the United Way of Greater Atlanta, the largest United Way in the national system, and he previously served as the president and CEO of the National Urban League. Over the course of his career, Milton has helped to raise more than $1 billion for local community needs and priorities. And finally, I'd like to welcome Shelley Waters Boots. Shelley brings more than 20 years of experience as a writer, researcher, and policy expert on a wide range of issues affecting the lives of children and families, and is also a national expert on 2-generation approaches to alleviating poverty for low-income families, working with philanthropy, state governments, and nonprofits to help them better align family services. She also leads a funder collaborative with philanthropic leaders from multiple sectors to invest in cross-cutting strategies aimed at improving the lives of youth and young adults. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today to share this important work. Adam, I'd like to start with you first, if we could. Can you tell us about the William T. Grant Foundation and how it came to focus on research and policy strategies to reduce inequality among young people?
Sure, I'd love to. First, I want to say thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and thank you to you, Sarah, for organizing this funder-to-funder conversation. In my 7 years as president of the William T. Grant Foundation, I found nothing more informative and illuminating than having the chance to speak to other funders. So it's a great gathering today. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 by William T. Grant, who was committed to understanding human behavior through research. Over the years, the Grant Foundation has addressed some of the most pressing challenges confronting young people. Now, those challenges change over time, and so consequently, the specific focus of the foundation has changed over time. By young people, we mean those ages 5 to 25 in the United States. The mission of the foundation is to support research to improve the lives of young people. Again, by young people, we mean those ages 5 to 25. Within that broad mission, we have two areas of focus. First, reducing inequality in youth outcomes, and second, research on improving the use of evidence from research in policies and practices that affect young people. Now, why were we led in 2014 to shift the focus of the foundation towards research on reducing inequality? Well, we were aware that income inequality had expanded over the past 40 years. There are many ways to demonstrate this. This chart is one of my favorites. It's from the famous economist Thomas Piketty, and it shows what share of total income is held by the top 10% of income receivers. Now, if income were evenly distributed, how much would the top 10% get? Well, they'd get 10%. But as you can see on the left side of the chart, in the early part of the 20th century, the top 10% of income recipients earned nearly half of all income received. And that underwent a period of compression when income inequality was dramatically reduced during the World War II and post-war era, all the way through until about 1980, when it began to rise again. And if you can see on the right side of the chart, and your view is not blocked by the photos of the speakers, you can see that income inequality is as high today as it was prior to the Great Depression. President Obama in 2013 declared income inequality the defining challenge of our time. And one more interesting feature of this chart, you can see the black triangles. That includes unearned as well as earned income, and that has diverged even more so. And that divergence has continued into our day. Think about the situation. Here we have the stock market and earnings from investments have continued to shoot up throughout this horrible pandemic, whereas earned income from jobs for many, especially low-wage workers, has plummeted as people have been put into unemployment. Now, understanding the challenges of inequality is not confined to the right and the left. Where do we stand today? Slide, thank you. Commentators on the right and the left have expressed concern. For example, Paul Krugman, noted left-leaning columnist for the New York Times, why inequality matters, but also the Wall Street Journal reports that inequality is damaging the US economy, as the Standard & Poor's study revealed. All too often, US policy is to hoard opportunities for the advantaged instead of extending them to the disadvantaged. You can see this in policies, especially tax policies like the mortgage tax write-off. That's a tax deduction you get if you have a mortgage. But if you don't have a mortgage, you don't get that tax benefit. Likewise for child care and college saving credits. Even healthcare benefits are untaxed. So if you get healthcare benefits through your employer, that's an untaxed benefit that those without, next slide, next animation, thank you, that those without such benefits don't receive. There are also labor market policies that favor the advantage. For example, in contrast to most other developed societies, the United States lacks paid family leave as a nation. And this benefits families that can afford to have one earner step outside the labor market for a period of time. Other nations have more inclusive policies, supporting families, childcare, health, education, and the workforce. So taking all of this into account, next slide, the William T. Grant Foundation has 4 reasons to support research on reducing inequality. First, Levels of inequality are exceptionally high. And you can see this in comparison to our own past history, as I just demonstrated with that slide from that chart from Thomas Piketty, or if you compare the United States today to other developed nations. We stand out in the extreme degree of our inequality. Second, excessive inequality is economically and socially harmful. It is a drain on our productivity, and it is socially divisive. Third, we are not paralyzed in the face of inequality. On the contrary, it is demonstrable that social policies can reduce inequality. So if you accept my first 3 points, that levels of inequality are high, that high inequality is harmful, and that we can do something about it, then I think you're bound to accept my fourth point, which is that we need research to identify effective programs, policies, and practices that will reduce inequality. Surely this is of interest to the incoming administration. For example, Janet Yellen, when she was head of the Federal Reserve, our incoming Treasury Secretary, stated that research may be able to provide evidence on which public policies are most helpful in building an economy in which people are poised to get ahead. Conversely, it would also be beneficial to understand why any policies may hold people back or discourage upward mobility. And this is a statement that we can get behind no matter what our political priorities are. So what does the William T. Grant Foundation hope to accomplish with our Reducing Inequality initiative? Well, for starters, we aim to identify effective programs, policies, and practices that work to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. But our thinking about this initiative is shifting. Why is that? Well, what have we learned so far? We've had several studies that we've supported that have identified specific approaches that significantly reduce inequality using designs that allow for judgment of cause and effect. We've supported other studies that have identified approaches that do not work, which can be just as informative if those failed approaches are widely used. And still other studies we've supported have identified mechanisms that, if leveraged, would reduce inequality in youth outcomes. But how far will this take us towards reducing inequality? It's a long way from identifying an effective program to actually reducing inequality for young people in America. Research we supported has influenced other research, but its reverberation in policy and practice is harder to trace. Now, we knew this going in. We do not expect any single study to be transformative. Rather, the point is for bodies of evidence to accumulate over time to make a difference in the real world. But over the past 5 years, as we've supported this line of research, we've recognized a more fundamental challenge to our aim of reducing inequality. Because effective programs and policies may help those who experience them, but they will not reduce inequality in a larger sense unless the structural conditions that create inequality in the first place are addressed. So this challenge calls on us to support research to disrupt those broader structural foundations of inequality, such as are revealed in systemic racism in our society and in the kind of opportunity hoarding I was describing earlier. So as we reflect on our efforts to reduce inequality and support research, which plays a key role, we can characterize our journey as moving from understanding inequality, how much, what are its sources, to reducing inequality. What can we actually do about it? And the next leg of our journey, from programs and policies to help those in need, to structural change that will create conditions that allow reduced inequality to persist and not be repeated generation after generation. So research has a role to play in the pursuit of social justice.
Thank you for that wonderful overview of the work of the William T. Grant Foundation and making the case for the investments in research to inform your efforts. I know that one example of that focus is your support for the 2019 National Academy's report, Roadmap for Reducing Child Poverty. What was the foundation seeking to learn from this report?
Thanks for that question, Sarah. You know, next slide. We recognize that at the local level, we can support families in need. And many of the research studies that we supported identified specific programs and policies that worked. But broad-based structural changes require shifts in policies at the federal level. So what policies and programs in a broad scale can achieve the goal of dramatic change, such as cutting child poverty in half within a decade? Is such a dramatic goal even feasible? What about possible trade-offs where if we implement a program to reduce poverty, it might have other consequences that are not so desirable? To answer these questions, we and 5 other private funders, as well as the US Congress, asked the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to convene an expert panel to assess the evidence and make recommendations for a dramatic reduction in child poverty.
So Larry, I'd like to invite you into the conversation now. Adam shared the William T. Grant Foundation's perspective on the Roadmap for Reducing Child Poverty report. Before we dig into the recommendations that came out of that report, can you provide us with a little bit more background on it? What were you and the other committee members charged with doing? Larry?
I can't start my video. It says the host has to. So if you can live without my face, I can get started.
We can't. We'll take care of that.
Well, now,
there you go.
Now a signal came. Apologies. Well, thank you very much. And to Sarah, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, to my other panelists, and to especially all of the local funders and activists who are joining us today for the webinar. Next slide. As Adam mentioned, there were a number of foundations and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services who funded this initiative. Next slide. And Adam called us a panel of experts. We were an interdisciplinary panel of experts with broad perspectives. There were conservative scholars of poverty and liberal scholars of poverty from these 5 major disciplinary perspectives: public policy, developmental psychology, medicine, child welfare, and economics. Next slide. And those of you who know about national academies, when Congress commissions a report by a consensus report by the National Academy, they negotiate what they call a statement of task. The statement of task guides everything that the National Academy of Science does in developing a consensus about an controversial issue based on the evidence. In this particular case, Congress asked us to do 3 things. The first is to review research linkages between child poverty and child well-being. What's the causal effect or the correlation between child poverty and indices of child well-being? The second is to provide an objective analysis of poverty-reducing effects of major assistance programs that currently exist directed toward children and families. And the third, which is the main thing they wanted us to get to based on the first 2, is to provide program and policy recommendations for reducing the number of children living in poverty. All of these had to be evidence-based, grounded in the literature, and scrupulously peer-reviewed and re-peer-reviewed and re-peer-reviewed. So National Academy of Science reports are highly scrutinized and vetted. Next slide, please. I'm going to very briefly summarize what we found in terms of our 3 tasks. In terms of reviewing research on linkages between child poverty and child well-being, next slide, we found 2 main things. The first is that for over 30 years, there have been very consistent correlations between being poor in childhood and experiencing a host of other adverse childhood experiences, from poor education, poor health, and mental and emotional, behavioral vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. But they were correlations, not causes. X is associated with Y, but X does not cause Y. If child poverty causes these adverse experiences, there's a clearer reason to act than if they are simply correlated. So the committee was charged with and did focus on causal studies. What are the studies that indicate to us that we can say definitively child poverty does or does not cause a host of other problems? Next slide. So with all the deliberations and all the reviews, we concluded that the weight of the causal evidence indicates that poverty does indeed cause negative child outcomes. Now, this might not sound that big a deal to all of you, but for 20 or 30 years, there have been arguments that poverty doesn't matter. It's only the correlates of poverty, like single parenthood or idleness, that cause the problems. These studies definitively indicate that poverty causes negative child outcomes, especially if it's early in childhood and persists through a large portion of childhood. Next bullet. And we further concluded this by reviewing many programs with strong experimental designs that alleviate poverty, either directly by providing income transfers like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or indirectly by funding in kind for food, housing, and medical benefits like SNAP and medical insurance. Next slide. That brings us to our second task. Our second task was how are we doing so far in poverty reducing effects of the major programs that exist? Next slide. And this slide explains those several chapters in one figure. We currently had in 2018 a child poverty rate of 13% with all the programs in place. If the programs that are meant to reduce child poverty were not in place, we would have a child poverty rate 8.7% percentage points higher. So 21.7% would be our child poverty rate instead of 13%. So the programs we have now, if we didn't have it, would increase child poverty by a whopping margin. You see that the biggest contributions are the federal tax programs, the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, and the Food Assistance Program, but other things make a contribution too. Next slide, please. And that brings us finally to our third task and our major task. Congress wanted us to provide evidence-based policy and program recommendations for reducing the number of children living in poverty in the United States by half within 10 years. The report goes into extensive descriptions of exactly how we did that, but this is with a general approach. Next slide. The general approach began by saying, is it even possible to do? Adam said this earlier. Do we have examples in history? Yes, we do. The UK cut its child poverty rate in half from 2001 to 2008. Canada's child benefit program is in the middle of cutting its child poverty rate in half right now through major policy changes. And if you take the really long view and you use the right measure, the United States has cut its child poverty in half from the early 60s till today. Back in the early 60s, using the right measure, the most accurate measure of child poverty, 28.4 percentage points of children were poor in the country. Today, 15.6%. But as you see, from 2000 to today, it's been quite flat in poverty reduction. That's the big dark line. The other dotted line is using the official poverty measure, which is a broken measure, and we can talk about some other time. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We actually, on the basis of extensive literature reviews and consultations and open hearings, we identified 20 individual program and policy options and tested their potential impact on child poverty. And because none of them worked individually one at a time, we also combined policies and programs into 4 packages. Let me tell you what we did. Next slide. First, we needed criteria for selecting the programs and policies that we were going to model and see their impacts. So the National Academy of Science requires strength of research and evaluation evidence as criterion number 1. And for this particular report, it was necessary to really focus like a laser beam on the magnitude of child poverty reduction. But we also wanted to keep 3 other considerations in mind. We didn't want to just reduce child poverty on average, but make sure that poverty reduction was at least as good and maybe better among high-risk groups, number 1. Number 2, that we could estimate the costs, and the costs would be worth the potential return on investment. And number 3, and this has befuddled both scholars and politicians for decades, there's always seemed to be a negative trade-off between certain kinds of anti-poverty policies and other kinds of things that American society values, like the dignity of work, like the sanctity of marriage, like opening up opportunity, and like reducing social inclusion. So we also wanted to track some of those things as well. Next slide. This is a summary of the simulated programs and policies. And you'll count 10 bullets there, and we had a more generous version and a less generous version of each of those. So some program and policies options are tied to work, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or the minimum wage. Others modify the existing safety net program, like food stamps and housing vouchers. Yet a third set of policies are modifications to the existing provisions related to immigration. And finally, and again, building on what Adam said, other countries have things to teach us about this. American exceptionalism is not the smartest thing to follow here. What other policies, like replacing tax credits with a universal allowance or child support assurance, could make a difference? Next slide. If we model the effects using simulation of each of these, and including what economists call the behavioral effects, what people do in response to the policy, how they behave, we find that none of the program policies that we were proposing, either the less generous EITC1 or the more generous EITC2 policies, got to our goal of reducing child poverty by 50%. The closest we came was to implement a child allowance, and the child allowance, especially the more generous form of child allowance, came close, but none of the individual policies worked one at a time. And to work, we'd have to get from that 13% to the 6.5% goal in the middle of the figure. Next slide. So we instead put packages of policies together in the hopes that the combination of EITC, the expanded child tax credit, and increased minimum wage, and the rollout of work advance could make a difference. We call these work-oriented policies, and it would reduce child poverty by 18%, 18.8%, and deep poverty by a little more. Most importantly, for the people who would be proponents of this, it included an increase in the number of low-income workers by 1 million. Rather than decreasing employment, it increased employment. So, and it estimated to cost about $8.7 billion. But 18% is not 50%, so we kept searching. And another set of policies packages were, if you could click through to the next slide, what we call work-based and universal support. Could we combine the work incentives of EITC and the child tax credit with the poverty alleviation of beginning a children's allowance, like a European children's allowance? Children's allowances are provided by governments for the support of families who are raising their children. They're universal, and they range anywhere from, in American equivalent terms, $2,000 a year to $5,000 a year. And if we implement those packages, we get up to 35% reduction in child poverty at a cost of about $44 billion. The third and fourth packages are the only ones we could devise that got us over the 50% threshold. The first one combines mean tested supports like expanding housing and food supplements with the tax credits of the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, the child care tax credit, excuse me. And the second one is universal supports and a work package. So instead of the housing and SNAP, it instead supports the child allowance and support assistance. Each of those reduce poverty or extreme poverty by 50 to 55%. And all three other packages besides the work package have a positive employment effect. They lead to 400,000 to 600,000 new low-income workers coming into the economy a year, but with a significant cost. The cost of $90 billion for package 3 and $108 billion for package 4. Before the pandemic, this seemed like big money, but now it maybe seems like an investment. It is big money. Next slide. What do we conclude from this? We conclude that no individual policy or program change is sufficient, that we have to bundle packages that combine work support and income support. And if we do that, we can not only reduce child poverty, but as Jason is going to tell us, increase employment. And that combination might be the sweet spot where we need to be. Next slide. I've indicated that the costs range from 8.7 billion estimated to 108 billion, but it's important to keep that in context. Good studies have estimated the annual cost of child poverty to the nation to be in the 800 billion to 1.1 trillion range. That means that for, pretend that the 1 trillion would reduce poverty, we could reduce poverty completely for $1 trillion. The 108 billion, to cut it in half, could return 4 times on the investment. It would cost $1 billion, $100 billion a year to have a cut in poverty of $400 to $500 billion a year. So putting the costs in that context, it seems like an investment instead of simply a cost. I'm nearly done. The next slide. We have an entire chapter that I think is highly relevant to the audience. And that is, what are things that those poverty policies don't touch that are going to impact the uptake of the policies and their success? And things like how the income is provided, whether it's stable and predictable, whether families have ready and equitable access to the programs, whether there's equitable treatment across race, ethnic, criminal justice, neighborhood conditions, and finally, health well-being. It's hard to be benefited by a work policy if you're structurally excluded from the labor force. So those contextual factors greatly influence the impact and success of anti-poverty programs. And we invite you to take a close look at those, because those are places where state and local governments and funders can make a big difference. Final slide, I think. Yes. Everything's online. You can learn about it at the National Academy of Science. And I apologize for going a few minutes over.
No problem. One question for you that actually I wanted to ask you, but we've already had a question in the Q&A box about this, so I think lots of people are wondering. You were talking about national programs and policies and really making the case for investing in them, but what role could a community foundation or other local funders, as opposed to national foundations like the William T. Grant Foundation, play in pursuing this type of federal action?
Well, there's a variety of roles they can play. The one that I encourage people to consider is that they play a role of advocating from the community for the national and federal policy change. Last time I looked, my member of Congress and my senator were much more interested in meeting Larry from Manhattan than the member of the National Academy of Sciences. That constituent and interest group representation of these interests from the local level local funders and local advocates should not underestimate the power they have to advocate for federal policy change. So that's one element of it. The other is one I already mentioned, which is if local funders could devise, fund, implement policies that make it easier for uptake, that make it easier for implementation, all those that address the structural barriers to success of the federal policies, many of which have to be really tailored to local and state conditions. Those are the two big roles that I would encourage our colleagues to consider.
Great, thank you so much for that, Larry. So Adam, I'd like to come back to you again if we could. The title of this webinar is Translating Good Policy into, or Good Research into Good Policy. Larry has really outlined what the research tells us. Can you share a little bit more about why the William T. Grant Foundation is working with the Bipartisan Policy Center to bring about the policy changes that are outlined in this report and that could reduce inequality for children and young people?
Sure. We got fantastic information from the the consensus panel that Larry just reported. We know that reducing child poverty is important. We know that it is feasible, and we know specific steps that can be taken at the national level to do that. So we have solid recommendations for policy, but how to turn that into real action? Because the William T. Grant Foundation, like many of the funders on this webinar, are not just an academic exercise. We want to bring about real change. Well, we recognize that for a change of this magnitude, it cannot just come from one actor or another actor. It's got to be a full spectrum across the aisle, bipartisan consensus. And there is a bipartisan basis for addressing inequality, as I stated at the beginning of my talk. So we work with the Bipartisan Policy Center. We supported the work of the Bipartisan Policy Center because they have a successful track record, including some work that we've supported them in before, a successful track record of bringing together folks from across the political aisle to work on shared values and shared strategies where we can find some agreement. Of course, there's not full agreement between Democrats and Republicans, but there are areas of consensus. So the Bipartisan Policy Center helps to find those areas of consensus, flesh them out, and helps legislators think about how to push those areas of consensus into sound policy.
Thank you. So turning to you now, Jason, can you build on what Adam was just sharing by providing with a little bit more context? How are you kind of engaging with bipartisan leaders and really turning this research into action and political change?
Well, thank you, and thanks for letting me be here with you. I'm going to try to get us kind of closer to back on time, and so the first thing I will do is cut short my depth of gratitude to CGLR and Adam and WT Grant. But this has been really, it's an important partnership for us, both in terms of the substance, but also kind of the spirit of the way the BPC works. As you have heard from Adam, we have a quaint affinity for evidence and a deep affection for action. And unfortunately, those are two ideas that don't come together as naturally as they used to in the policymaking process. There are a lot of folks who know a lot, and often they wind up doing the least. And unfortunately, the opposite is also true. So when we think about evidence and action, just in kind of practical terms, we think about it as impact and probability. And my organization has about 100 staff. We have most folks on the think tank side, but we also employ paid federal lobbyists, so we can actually tell the truth when we talk to Congress. It is a separate organization, but the leader of that exercise, my colleague Michelle Stockwell, is on the line. And if we get into the Q&A and anyone wants to know about the dark arts of actually influencing Congress, we can call her into the discussion. But ultimately, we care about impact and probability. And this issue set, this kind of questions around both the suite of policies that were suggested in the NAS study and also kind of a broader working family agenda, we think is in fact the best combination of impact and likelihood, which is why we've been so invested here. I should just say a couple more words about the kind of the entry point. And as Larry indicated, this is an issue. These are issues that have had a pedigree of bipartisan support. And a lot of the work we do at the BPC is actually protecting issues that have historically had ideological currency across the aisle from becoming absorbed into kind of the reflexive partisanship that has dominated much of the last years. And the way to do that is to work with people who have significant credibility on the left and the right. With this issue, the EITC, if my memory suits, was actually brought in under the Nixon administration. It's been expanded by almost every administration since. Child tax credit was a Clinton initiative, which has also been improved upon. And even in the slightly horrific 2017 tax bill, we worked closely with Rick Santorum and Marco Rubio to have a significant plus up in resources for early childhood support. One of the few really bright spots in that legislation. So it is possible. The other thing I will just say as we kind of end introduction one, is talk a little bit about where we are heading into 2021. Big picture. One thing is clear from the last election is that neither party has a mandate. One of the unfortunate traditions of Washington is one party winning 2 by 3% of the popular vote and claiming that they then have the national compelling interest to essentially run the table through one party rule that usually results in accomplishing one thing and then going into kind of a trench for 2 years until the midterm. It is absolutely clear that neither party has the capacity to govern without some aspect of support from the other. It is a good thing that Senator McConnell recently acknowledged the victory of Vice President-elect Biden. That begins to normalize the discussion. Senator McConnell waited until he knew that the government wasn't going to shut down, and it looks like they had their $900 billion deal. I personally wish he didn't see those two things as asymmetric to acknowledging the outcome of the election, but it is a step forward. The crisis creates incredible urgency, but it also narrows the agenda towards these issues. If this were a moment where we did not have an economic crisis and a pandemic, an incoming Democratic president would be compelled to focus on the big structural issues with huge base activism, climate change, immigration, as well as this kind of opportunity agenda. The pandemic kind of clears the road for these issues. I do not think you're going to see the Biden administration focusing outside of the kind of jobs, employment, and just family sustainability agenda. We put out a solutions summit all last week, which we'd be happy to share with you, which identified kind of 9 key issues that we think are essential to getting the country back in business. It's not just that the issues themselves are important, but democracy is a team sport and momentum matters a lot. And getting some quick wins on the board, we think is really, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, but essential to the future of American democracy. And I'll just kind of end this response by noting that we did this Solutions Summit last week. One of our guests was former Ohio Governor, Governor Kasich. His kind of summation was that the necessity was for Democrats to be less crazy and Republicans to be less obstructionist, which could become the new tagline for the BPC. But just to add a little bit of nuance to this, I know a lot of folks have a hard time believing that this is possible. Many of the 120 Republican House members who signed the ridiculous Texas lawsuit are people we work with. Under the right circumstances, they're collaborative and constructive and smart and evidence-based. Many of the Democrats who have jumped on agenda items which are polarizing and have very low likelihood of outcome are people we work with. And so don't ask the question, will Congress be constructive or not? It will be both. They will have constructive moments where if we create the lanes, they can get stuff done. They will have destructive moments which will humiliate and frustrate all of us. And our goal at the BPC is to create the incentives for them to be able to really achieve progress. And this is a set of issues where we think that's possible.
Great, I love that framing. So has the pandemic and resulting economic crisis influenced the prospects to reform and expand these tax credits?
Just a little bit about this, but I can just add a little more. So, as you all know, as well as I, it has revealed incredible frailty and inequity in our society. And of course, it is the most vulnerable who have been hit the hardest. I think about 1 million kids have fallen into poverty since the pandemic began. The amount of childhood hunger is astounding. And I believe we're going to see a tsunami of housing crises as we move forward into the winter and spring. So the urgency to do something is intense. The question is, when do we get from the inflection point of enabling people to simply survive absent economic activity to becoming reemployed? And I think that is really the moment where this kind of tax package becomes extremely important. There's one aspect of the work which we've focused on. I again don't think this comes as a huge surprise, but the policies that have the most bipartisan traction are these policies linked to work. And as Larry points out, there's a very strong argument, evidence-based argument to demonstrate that these investments do in fact increase employment. But about 90% of all the gains in the last 30 years have gone to people above the poverty line. The programs that have the most support tend to be going towards people who are employed, or at least favor people who are employed. The pandemic has created deep structural unemployment. And so figuring out how we recalibrate these policies towards the reality of this moment, which is a depth of deprivation that defies small investments without losing and sacrificing the bipartisan pedigree, I think is one of the challenges we're most focused on.
So we posted a link to the Solution Summit that you were referencing previously, so people can dig into that and learn more. But any kind of key insights that you could share from those, in addition to what you mentioned before?
Well, so we're arguing for the fierce urgency of pragmatism, and we really think that this is kind of a jump ball. If President-elect Biden can advance a kind of working families agenda focusing on kids, incentives for work, and wealth creation and financial security, we think there will be Republicans who are with it. If they can move forwards on an infrastructure investment, which is again jobs focused, we believe that they'll be able to motivate some collaborative support. And again, there's a lot of pent up need, desperation, and fury coming from our friends to our left, and that's going to be a big fight. I think our view, you won't be shocked by it, is that most revolutions are actually a series of evolutionary steps if you look at them closely. And our goal is to figure out what are the issues where we can achieve positive impact helping people and build political power, right? Most of the time, we find that big achievements destroy or deplete political power, and we have to have a durable agenda. And so, the ideas we call out are not necessarily the most important ideas in the world, but they are the significant impacts that we think could actually happen in the first few months of next year.
So where do we go from here? What are you planning to do in the first few months or throughout the next year, 2021? And is there a role for community-based organizations and local funders, many of whom are listening in, eager to hear from you answering this question in this national debate?
It is a generous and I think everyone realizes not entirely spontaneous question, and I do have a few thoughts. In terms of where we go, it's going to be about COVID relief in the first several months of next year. I think it is likely that we will see this $900 billion package pass, which is incredibly important for people who are struggling to get by. It also, frankly, takes that set of issues off the table for a little while, creating more space for kind of the tier 2 issues about investment in the future, which is really where kind of EITC, CTC, and others start to come in. So that's a good issue. Had it not been for the COVID crisis, we were focusing on the instability of tax reform, because these are tax provisions and they're not likely to be passed absent a broader tax package. I think that's even true in the midst of the current pandemic. And so the 2017 tax bill starts to become unstable next year. One of the ways that it was made to increase the deficit less than it would have otherwise was by having a lot of the provisions that the business community was really most invested in expire after 5 years. And so it is the combination of the COVID lens and then the structural instability of the tax package and the new politics in Washington that we think creates a really significant lane. There are about 150 new members of Congress since 2018, right? The churn, there's this idea of incumbency lasting forever, but the churn through Congress has been intense. And so there's just a lot of engagement and education. The fact that so many states have EITC programs is a really strong entry point to a conversation because it kind of localizes and authenticates the issue. Just a couple more ideas. Policy packages, really important what the NAS did with policy packages. We think about packages a lot. right? The premise of collaboration is either finding kind of a middle point on one idea. It's usually better to find a combination of issues that collectively make real progress and also motivate broad buy-in. And so we are looking at trying to put together, as we often do, a variety of different political puzzles that would enable broad coalitions of folks to get on board, and spend a lot of time testing those ideas and figuring out what combination of issues makes, you know, substantive coherence and also has kind of political traction. We are focusing a lot on disparate impacts. I think this came up in a couple of different conversations. You know, this is a simplification, but for much of our work, we've used, you know, poverty as proxy for racial equity. And while there's unfortunately a strong signal there, that's not a complete solution. And so starting to understand the disparate impacts among these policies, it's not just a question of intention and goodwill, it's really hard work. And so I think, you know, organizations like ours and others, frankly, often don't have the capacity to do that kind of sophisticated assessment. And so we're going to be working hard to change that. Last, the vast majority of members of Congress we work with are really good people with really bad incentives. And they are people pleasers. They are unfortunately pretty rational. And so when they do things that seem just kind of sucky, it's because they feel threatened by their local constituents if they don't take that action. When we ask members of Congress to be courageous, what we're basically saying is do something that's important for the national interest that, you know, alienates your most aggressive constituents. Those are tough calls. And so I think I just reiterate what Larry said. You all could change those incentives. You know, having your local representatives understand that you care about these issues and you're willing to fight for them and you're willing to support them will matter. And, you know, the good news in our experience is you don't have to change the incentives all that much to enable them to actually get some stuff done. So happy to be more tactical with you, recognize clearly that you are not lobbying organizations. I tend to find that most organizations without lobbyists dramatically exaggerate the limitations on what they can do. I think it's a cultural issue more than a legal issue. And, you know, we have some really good lawyers, so we'd be delighted to work with you all. I know Council on Foundations and others do this too, but to help you understand what the breadth of your opportunities are to be influential, because I think they're quite great. And I'll wrap.
All right, great. There might be some local funders and organizations that might be reaching out to take you up on that offer. So thank you. Now we'd like to invite our community commentator into the conversation, Milton Little. We'd like to start with you. Love to hear your thoughts about all that we have just heard. I know that in recent years, United Way of Greater Atlanta has been advancing efforts to increase child well-being across the 13 county Metro Atlanta area, including a focus on increased economic stability for families. So given those efforts, what are your reflections on all that you have just heard that Adam, Larry, and Jason have shared today?
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and to participate in this. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher, and so I'll say that I was in the choir listening to the preachers speak. I subscribe to everything that has been said. I've been leading this United Way for 13 years. I ran the one in Boston for 3 before that. But my background before that's in public policy, in workforce research, in corporate philanthropy. So I have touched each of the spheres that our previous speakers have talked about. And we've tried to use those lens in the work of child well-being. Jason talked about using poverty as a proxy for equity. In Atlanta, we have used child well-being as a proxy for racial disparity and equity. And we've organized our work around how do you improve the well-being of children as a vehicle for addressing the issues related to economic insecurity, food insecurity, health insecurity, educational disparity, all the topics that Sarah have been talked about. And we try to do it given the unique place that we occupy within philanthropy. And that is that we are trying to speak to individual donors to get them to understand and care about these issues in the same way that we're trying to speak to institutional donors, whether they be government, private foundations, community foundations, or others. So we're on the ground where all of these issues at a policy level, at a theoretical and practical level, all have to try to come to play to try to make a difference in the lives of children, families, and communities. So would you like me to, I can carry forward through the work that we're
Yes,
doing.
please go on.
So as I said, we've got that unique role that we play. And so part of it's how you frame it for individuals and folks who may be able to help, because they may not understand the translations that Larry tried to provide, and we've tried to simplify them in a way that somebody who's going to make a purchase decision in their philanthropic decision-making is going to be able to do. So we created a child spokesperson, Priya Ferguson, who was 7 years old when we found her. She's now one of the leads in the Netflix, in one of the Netflix shows. And so we like to say we've made her famous, but she's been our way of helping people understand that we've got to create a condition in which every child in Greater Atlanta is doing well. And that's not the case because of the disparities that exist across Greater Atlanta. Bloomberg's identified Atlanta as the most unequal city in America. Raj Chetty has identified the social and economic mobility rate of Atlanta as one of the lowest in the country. So we've got a lot of fertile ground in order to make a difference. We created something called the Child Wellbeing Index that on 14 different indicators helps to measure the well-being of children down to the zip code level. And so you put your zip code in our website, and you can know how many kids live in that zip code and how they're faring and how their families are faring against each one of these indicators. Let's move to the next slide. But you'll see they harken back to what Larry and Adam and others were speaking about with respect to where we need to be focusing. There are 500,000 children across Greater Atlanta that live in these communities of low and very low child well-being. We created this index on a scale of 0 to 100. In some of those red areas there, the child well-being level is down around 20 to 30. In the green levels, those are the places where child well-being is above 90%. So you can see just these disparities. It's the same map if you look at housing instability. It's the same map if you look at food insecurity in Greater Atlanta. It's the same map if you look at other measures of economic insecurity. So the overall child well-being index was 58.9 when we started this in 2017. Next slide. Prior to the launch of COVID, we were making good progress. In just 2 years, we were able to move this score up 3 percentage points on that scale of 100. But COVID hit, and the pandemic, as Jason said, and all of us know, revealed the deep and seemingly intractable disparities across education, income, health, homelessness, criminal justice, housing, and a variety of other areas. Next slide. So our work has been really focused on a number of areas. We'll highlight economic stability here. Next slide. Our goal is to try to improve the family financial stability by 10%. And going back to what Larry was talking about, it's a combination of improving the rate of employment among the target populations, but it's also making sure that we can combine their work effort with their engagement in all of the systems that provide income supports. So we also run a VITA program to help bring VITA and the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit to these families as well. So we subscribe to the notion that it's not a program that's going to solve this problem, but it's going to be the conjoining of individual activities in terms of work performance on families, as well as systems helping to ensure that those families get the benefits that they need as ways to move in a stepladder way out of poverty. Next slide. And none of these data are a surprise to you. We've got 40% of people in Greater Atlanta that don't have $400 to pay for a surprise expense. We've got 20% who didn't have insurance or sick leave. Only 1 in 3 families could work remotely during the pandemic. A third of families lack childcare, and that creates problems. What's not on this slide is spatial mismatch. We've got families that don't live anywhere near where the job growth in Greater Atlanta takes place, and we've got public transportation that cannot get you from where you live to where the job is. And so families need a car, but their economic circumstances prevent them from being able to buy one. So they're caught in this maze and caught in this spiral that seems to hold them where they are, not help push them where they want to go. Next slide. So we close with what I think is consistent across what we've heard today. It is about systems and how we can make systems work more effectively. And I'll add that research findings are important, policy solutions are important, but all of us on the ground need to figure out a way in which we can move public will in order to fully make these things happen. At the end of the day, for me, where I sit, it's about how do you get the intentionality that's necessary to turn policy prescriptions, research findings into actions that ultimately provide the outcomes that we're looking for the families and communities that we serve. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Milton. Love to turn to you now, Shelley, if we could. Given all of the research that you've done on two-generation approaches to alleviating poverty for low-income families and bipartisan strategies for improving the lives of children, what are your thoughts on what you've just heard today, and especially in terms of the role that funders can play in addressing or advancing this work?
Great, thanks, Sarah. And again, amazing to be with this esteemed group of leaders. I think we could do another hour easily. So thanks for the opportunity. I think I'm just gonna, at this point, since we're running short on time, be a little bit of a provocateur and put a couple of things out for thought, pulling on some threads that I think every speaker today has talked through, and try to make it relevant to philanthropic community. I've been doing philanthropic advising for the last 14 years. And I think philanthropy plays a very important role in figuring out how to reduce inequality, how to address opportunity, and how to build upward mobility. And those are all themes I think everybody's touched on. So one thread I want to pull out, and I think Larry alluded to this, but that a lot of this is sort of contingent on work and increased work. And I think we all find that work is a huge value. But as we're moving these policies forward to really try to think about the increase in work hours and who that reaches and who it might not reach. And I think two issues that have been touched upon here that are important to highlight. One is around another area that I've done a lot of work on where we have solid research on impacts both on work participation, but also on child well-being, is around mental health and parental mental health. So it's hard to work and be a caregiver if you're struggling with mental health or behavioral challenges. So I would pull that thread out a bit. I think the other thing the pandemic has really shown is the challenges of balancing work with caregiving. And if you don't have an infrastructure to support caregiving, it's also very hard to increase hours and to get to a job. So I'm really appreciative of the work BPC has done, both on childcare, continuing to keep that issue in the bipartisan space. But another area I've been working on with BPC folks is on paid family and medical leave, which is surprisingly becoming more bipartisan, I think, thanks to the good work that Jason and his team are doing. We had a report coming out of BPC with, again, former Senator Santorum and former Senator Dodd talking about the importance of paid family and medical leave. And again, this is an important piece to work, especially for low-income families, not just because it gives you time off to bond with your child, but also protects that job, because in a lot of ways, a sick kid can lead to basically getting fired from your job, and you're still on then a endless cycle of low wage work and not being able to move up. So those are a couple things I'd add, I think, as themes that threads we can be pulling on, in addition to the great policies that the National Academy report and the great work that Larry and his colleagues did. The other one, two generation, I think this theme of bundling is one to lift up, because the two generation approaches, or the bundling of policies that directly affect both children and their parents together, I think is a key point to be thinking about, and something that I think local and statewide funders can pay attention to as well. Milton pointed out that a lot of what happens that comes down from the federal level still comes down in silos and makes it very challenging for families to access the full range of supports and services. And for families right now in deep poverty, while some of these income supports and work support strategies are helping and can help, these long-term impacts of trauma and systemic racism mean that for some families, a very intensive package of supports is needed. A lot of that packaging and making access to benefits and supports available happens at under Block granted programs for the most part, that states and communities can decide how they deliver those programs and supports, who gets those programs and supports, and how we can make sure that there's a set of intensive programs that are aligned to support both the outcomes for parents and their children. And then lastly, and again, Milton hinted at this a little bit, but I am taken by the research of Raj Chetty and Opportunity Insights about how place really matters. And place matters even with addressing income inequality. There are other factors that really affect what we call intergenerational mobility, which is basically whether you as a child are going to end up landing at a different economic spot compared to your parents. And some of those factors, I think, are ones that we need leadership from local and state donors to really start to address, because they're very hard to pull at those factors through federal intervention. Not that they can't be pulled through federal intervention, but I think there's a lot that can be done at the state and local level. And the factors that Chetty points out, in addition to income inequality, are less segregation. So you have more economic mobility if there's less segregation in your communities, greater social capital, better primary schools, and greater family stability. So those are all policy areas, in addition to whether or not you have income inequality in your community, that can have a huge impact on whether or not you have intergenerational economic mobility. And again, I think if there's any theme I've picked up from today, that it's really this issue of combination of factors, of bridging across divides to come up with a collaborative approach for what is a huge national challenge, but a challenge that the National Academy report has beautifully laid out, that is not out of our reach, and something we can all aspire to and get to with very practical policy solutions. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Shelley. So we'd now like to open it up for Q&A. I know we've been seeing a number of questions being posted in the Q&A box. The first one I'd like to start with is for you, Dr. Aber. Michael Gold has posted a question saying that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the #1 factor driving Americans into poverty is medical expenses. In 2019, 8 million Americans, most of them children, fell below the poverty line because of family medical bills. So Michael is asking you if you could please comment on the impact that Medicaid expansion might have in the context of these other national measures, along with the other measures that you were mentioning, the other programs and policies out of the report.
Thank you. My video seems to be off still, but thank you, Michael, for the really good question. I'm going to begin with a nerdy brief answer and then a real brief answer. The nerdish brief answer is the current poverty measure, the supplemental poverty measure, the one I said was the good measure, does a better job than the official poverty measure, but it does not handle medical expenses adequately. So we have to begin by making sure that both the medical benefits that families receive and the medical expenses that they have get factored into a health-related supplemental poverty measure. And there are proposals to do that. We got to get the right thermometer to take the temperature on that issue, because I think people don't realize it as much as they do, because we're not measuring its impact on poverty and health the way we should. The second is, it's hard to run a horse race against all the multiple factors that have lead to child poverty. I agree that medical expenses is a huge contributor. So are many, many other things. And just like we're talking about policies of packages on the solution side, we should be thinking about sets of predictors and risks for poverty, and lack of medical insurance is another. For those of you who don't know, I think it's called RIP. There's a philanthropic group that buys medical debt from companies on pennies on the dollar, and then relieves the owners of that medical debt, the individuals of that medical debt. So that's a real, I gave a lot of my end of year giving to that organization because of the importance of the issue you're raising, Michael.
So would others like to comment on that question? I know that there's a lot that could be shared. Jason, any work that you're doing around it, or Adam?
So I would say that there's so much work we're doing around it. I'm not sure that intervention now makes a ton of sense. I will just vindicate the premise that Medicaid expansion has been profoundly effective. We have an equal challenge to make sure that we can start to figure out the costs of Medicaid, because the country's just broke, and at a certain point we stop doing smart things. I will also note just a tiny little crumb of optimism. It looks like Congress is going to move forwards on surprise medical billing, which is an issue that affects all income rates, but has been incredibly pernicious for people without a lot of social capital to all of a sudden get a $17,000 bill from a hospital because there was an argument between the hospital and the insurance company. And that has been driving people on the edge into bankruptcy. And so there's a little bit of positive movement there.
And I would follow by asking Larry or Jason to comment on the inclusion of immigrant families in the Medicaid expansion, and to the extent that immigrant families are excluded, including mixed documentation status families where, for example, the children are US citizens and yet are not receiving health care coverage because their parents are not citizens, how that figures into child poverty.
Doesn't help. I think, as you all know, a lot of our immigration policy has of late seemed to be a combination of cruelty and economics. And I believe that this administration is going to try as much as it can to change that. A lot of the policies are in fact driven by executive branch decision-making and don't require legislation. So I think, the kinds of issues like you just raised have the potential to be addressed quickly. I do not anticipate comprehensive immigration reform being on the calendar for the first couple of years. And just to give you a sense of what a tough job it is, the Mexican economy is unraveling. And there's a very real chance that we will have tens of thousands of people fleeing poverty in Mexico, creating an incredibly difficult challenge for the incoming administration.
We noted this issue in the National Academy of Science report. But going back to my nerdy response to Michael, we could make progress and not pick it up because of the problems in the child poverty measure that don't treat medical issues adequately. So I think that's a serious issue.
And we at the William T. Grant Foundation have funded a panelist on the National Academy's report, Dolores Acevedo Garcia at Brandeis University, to work with a national organization called Unidos US to investigate this question further and to identify potential policy responses.
She was the leader of that part of the report, and she's a national treasure.
So building on this question around the reducing barriers for immigrants, we've been talking about medical and healthcare access. Suzanne Harbin was asking about reducing barriers for immigrants to access support services beyond that. It's a major issue in her community in northern Georgia. She was wondering if either you, we could start with you, Larry, if you could, or other panelists could expand on opportunities for that, and what can what can her organization as a local funder do to help underutilization of services for immigrants? Besides DACA, what is being done to help younger children receive services?
Boy, I would defer to people in your audience who probably are closer to successful community strategies. So I will just say that from my point of view, anti-poverty policy is grade level reading policy at the local level. Federal anti-poverty policy is pro-immigration policy at the local level. We don't have to separate out the local and the federal. We're looking for synergies, and so. But that's not an adequate answer. I invite someone else to have an adequate answer.
I can add two equally unsatisfactory thoughts. The first is that we've done a lot of polling and a lot of engagement on the immigration issue, trying to figure out, where are those lanes. Surprising and a little bit discouraging that the majority of opposition to immigrants is based upon the premise that they are inappropriately accessing benefits. Far more significant than any concern about jobs or border crossings. Like, that is the compelling narrative. It is part of the reason why the last administration jumped so hard on this kind of public charge issue. It's complicated, but it's also largely not true, right? So this is a moment where, actually, and I think, Adam, this is much of what I expect you're doing, starting to kind of peel that apart a little bit and figuring out how to, this is necessary not just for this critical issue, but I think for the wholesomeness of an immigration reform agenda. That's where we're focusing. I think the only other thing, just much broader point, but can't let it go, the issue about the social capital to access existing programs, we think is incredibly important and probably the highest benefit, lowest political cost thing that we could do. We have seen lots and lots of examples where well-intended programs wind up helping real estate developers and middle to upper middle class white folks. And it's complicated, but it does not require legislation. It requires community engagement, philanthropic engagement, people who understand bureaucracy. And so it's not that sexy. We're having a hard time getting people interested in it, but I think it's a really important place to focus some shared attention.
Amen.
We've got a couple of questions that relate to either higher education and the impact of higher education institutions in communities and supporting opportunity youth. I'm going to kind of try to package them all together. So in particular, what role do HBCUs play in early childhood and public school education, after school care? So community supports that they provide in their community. And more broadly speaking, the role that institutions of higher learning, so HBCUs and other post-secondary institutions that are located in or near struggling communities, and this might be good for you, Milton, with a focus on place-based strategies. What role can they play now and in the future in assisting this work, and especially thinking about that opportunity youth population, 15 to 24-year-olds who are disconnected from both school and employment?
Well, I'll speak quickly. The Atlanta University Center, that's made up of HBCU, Spelman, Morehouse, ITC, which is the seminary, as well as Clark, were the organizing framework for the Promise grants that we ran, as well as the Choice Neighborhood grants that were focused on this combination of education and housing stability. And so, our experience in Atlanta is that HBCUs can play an important role, both in the promotion of early learning, but as well as using the good agency of the faculty and staff and the expertise they bring. And they're always searching for community solutions activities, and we've been able to aggregate their efforts in important ways. Clark, as an example, has one of the premier cancer centers in the United States, and so they're bringing that resource to bear in a state that has not expanded Medicaid.
I might jump in, Sarah, too, if I can. Thanks. Yeah, I think Milton is spot on the role of HBCUs and community colleges and post-secondary education institutions as being really important hubs of opportunity in communities. But specifically on Opportunity Youth, another National Academy study that I was involved in with 8 other wonderful foundations has been on the promise of adolescence, which came out around the same time, but leaned pretty heavily on some of the findings that came out of this National Academy report. And there, the consensus panel looks at health, mental health, education, and the justice systems, and the set of recommendations, policy recommendations that are really important, I think, to pursue to address what is our next biggest developmental sort of open window after early childhood, which is the years of adolescence. And surprisingly, at least to me, those years of adolescence started about age 10, if you listen to the scientists, and ended about age 25. So we have a huge opportunity for, as youth and young people are developing and overcoming and building resilience in very challenging times these days. Another important report to bring into this conversation. I'll post it.
The more we learn about brain development and the more we learn about windows of opportunity to influence, don't worry, middle childhood is there too. There's fascinating new work, and it really goes to the point that early intervention is especially helpful, but strategies throughout the life cycle from birth to early adulthood have to be part of the solution. There is no magic bullet.
Agreed, and I just want to make sure everybody sees, I believe Adam has been busy posting some great links in the chat box. Thank you so much for that, Adam. Both the work of the Grant Foundation around supporting immigrant communities, or research grants to combat youth inequality exacerbated by COVID-19, focus on immigrant populations, but also that recent National Academy's report about the promise of adolescence. So thank you so much for that. And just a reminder to everybody that we will be sending out a follow-up email that includes all of these links as well as the recording so that you can go back and explore this more later. We've got another question from Sandra Woodford, who is preparing for a listening session with their Senate delegate and wants to know what is the single most important policy issue that they should ask their local senator to address as it relates to funding requests. And also sharing that they will be launching a community school strategy locally in the coming year. So we've talked about the importance of packages, but what would be the one?
I will be not shy. What we talked about in the report as a child allowance is very, very similar to the child tax credit. The child tax credit is of growing interest to both sides of the aisle, increasing the child tax credit. And there are policy proposals in the American Family Act and from Senators Bennett and Brown on Dems, and with Rubio and Lee on the Republican side. There's a lot of interest in an American version of a children's allowance, and that will have the single biggest impact on child poverty in America.
I think that's an exceptionally good answer. And to take it from truth to tactic, it would also be very useful for that state legislator to be aware of how that money gets used at the state level, right? One of the challenges we often have is people go to advocate And then an intelligent staff member will say, well, what did you do with the $73 million that Arkansas got? And they don't know the answer. So I think making sure that you have not just geographic resonance, but actually substantive anecdote, I think is pretty key to being effective.
You're muted, Sarah.
Thank you for that. We've come to the end of our 90 minutes together. Quickly, Elizabeth Mills was asking about an infographic that can show the impact of investment costs and the reduction of cost poverty. I'll work to get that and include that in the follow-up email, unless you could answer it really quickly, Larry.
Nope.
Nope. Okay. All right. Then I just want to remind everyone to fill out the evaluation survey. We'll leave it open until we close down the webinar. But I want to say a huge thank you, oh my goodness, to all of our panelists today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this incredibly important and insightful work. And really laying out this roadmap for tackling child poverty and improving outcomes for children. Thank you to Adam Gameron, to Larry Aber, to Jason Grumet, to Milton Little, and to Shelley Waters Boots. I'd also like to say thank you to all of you who joined in and asked questions and shared comments and feedback in the chat box. I hope that you found it as informative and inspiring as I did. And then I'd invite you all to tune back in about an hour for our next session. You can see on the screen in front of you, we'll be kind of exploring strategies for scaling playful learning in communities. So we'll be hearing from civic leaders who have done that. And then I'd also invite you to join us again next year after you have a wonderful and happy and healthy holiday. We've got a couple of sessions planned for early January, but we'll be continuing every Tuesday afternoon. So hope to see you next year. Until then, thank you all again. Thank you to our panelists, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Sarah. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody.